My name is Elena. For 18 years, I've been paid to find the one number that doesn't belong. That's the short version of what a forensic accountant does. Companies bring me their books when something feels off and nobody can say what. I go in and I don't stop until I find the transaction that doesn't reconcile. The invoice paid twice, the account opened and closed in the same afternoon. The number someone hoped would disappear inside a bigger one. It usually works for a while. Then I find it. I was good at this. I still am. I've sat across from CEOs and told them calmly that their own controller had been moving money for 3 years and watched their faces do the thing faces do when a story stops holding weight. I never raised my voice. I didn't need to. The numbers did that part. I just had to be patient enough to lay them out in order. I'm telling you this so you understand how my mind works, not to impress you. I don't trust a story until I've seen the paperwork under it. Somewhere along the way, that turned into more than a job skill. It became how I looked at everything. Except, it turns out, the people closest to me. That's the part that took me a long time to understand about myself. I could unravel a decade of buried fraud in an afternoon in a boardroom, then go home for the holidays and let my own sister tell a story about my life that wasn't true, without ever opening the file. I never audited her. Not really. I noticed things, small inconsistencies, dates that didn't line up, a version of events that only worked if you didn't look too closely, and I filed them away instead of following them. I told myself that was kindness. Maybe some of it was. But an accountant knows the difference between generosity and avoidance. And for 10 years, I chose not to find out which one I was practicing. This is the story of the one relationship I never thought to audit. And what happened the year I finally did. If you've heard my stories before, you know how this goes. No yelling, no scenes, no revenge for its own sake. Just what happened, laid out in order. And enough patience to let the truth do its work once you give it room. This is one people ask me to retell. I understand why. It has a moment in it nobody forgets once they've heard it. I haven't either. I can still close my eyes and hear it. A single small sound in a room that had gone completely silent. That's where I'll start. The glass hit the floor before my sister's hand seemed to notice it was empty. It was a good glass, crystal, a wedding gift, the kind you're told to hand wash so it doesn't cloud. It didn't shatter so much as come apart. One clean sound, then nothing. 12 people around a dining table, and for 4 or 5 seconds the only noise in the room was the last piece of glass settling against the hardwood. I didn't flinch. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I'd had 10 years to picture this moment, and in every version I imagined myself shaking or crying or finally saying everything I'd swallowed. Instead, I just watched my sister's face at the exact moment the story she'd spent a decade building met the one piece of paper she'd never accounted for. I'm not going to tell you what was on that paper yet. Not to be coy about it. You need the years underneath first, or the paper won't mean what it's supposed to. By the time we get back to that dining room, you'll understand why the sound of that glass breaking was the quietest thing to happen in our family in a decade. But the story doesn't start there. It starts 3 years earlier at my own engagement party, on a night I still remember down to the color of the tablecloths. Ivory, not white. I remember arguing with the venue about that for weeks, certain it mattered more than it did. My fiancé's name was David. We'd been together 4 years, and an engagement party is the kind of event where you finally exhale because the hard part is supposedly over. Everyone said so. Now you just plan a wedding. My sister Renee offered to help. She was between jobs that year, which made sense. She had the time and I didn't, and she was good at logistics the way some people are good at making themselves indispensable. She started with the venue calls, then the seating chart. Then she was calling David directly because it was faster than routing it through me. I didn't notice one dramatic moment. There was no discovery, no confrontation, no scene I can point to and say that's where it started. What I noticed instead was a slow redistribution of time, of inside jokes, of who David called first when something went wrong with the caterer. An accountant learns to watch totals shift long before anyone announces a change in ownership. That's what this was. By the 6-month mark, David and I had quietly, almost politely come apart. Neither of us was cruel about it. We just stopped being the 2 people planning a wedding and became 2 people who both happened to know Renee very well. I moved out in March. I didn't cry in front of anyone. I filed it the way I file everything, noted, dated, set aside for later. Renee and David were engaged by October. I want to give you the timeline exactly as I understood it, because the timeline is the whole point. Renee had the baby the following August, 11 months after their engagement, 17 months, almost to the week, after David and I ended things. I did that math once alone in my car outside my new apartment, and then I did it again because I didn't like what it implied the first time and wanted to be wrong. I wasn't wrong. I was just quiet about it. Over time, the family's version of that year turned into a love story, the kind people repeat at holidays without meaning any harm. Renee had been so devoted, everyone said. She'd stepped in during a hard time and somehow found her own happiness in the middle of it. Nobody asked me to correct the timeline. I didn't offer to. I told myself that was generosity. I told myself a lot of things that year. What I didn't tell anyone was that I was pregnant too, and alone about it on purpose. I left the city before I started showing. Not dramatically, I told people it was a job opportunity, which was true, just not the whole truth. I had my son that winter, 400 miles from anyone who might have done the same math. No announcement, nothing posted. I told myself I was protecting him from a story that wasn't his to carry yet. 2 years later, at a cousin's wedding, Renee said the thing that would define the next decade. I hadn't talked much about my life by then, and someone asked, not unkindly, whether I was seeing anyone, whether there'd be a baby someday. Renee answered before I could, gently, like she was delivering news to spare me the burden of saying it myself. "It's easier," she told me afterward, quietly in the kitchen, just the two of us, "if people just think what they think. You don't owe anyone the details. Let them assume. It's kinder, honestly, for everyone." I remember exactly how she said it. Not cruel, almost tender, like she was doing me a favor. I didn't correct her that night. I told myself I'd get to it eventually, when it mattered less, when the timing was better. I didn't yet understand that Renee wasn't offering me privacy. She was building an alibi. I didn't set out to build a case, and it would be easy looking back to make it sound like I spent 10 years plotting something. I didn't. I did what I always do, which is keep records. It's not a strategy. It's a habit, the same way some people check twice that the door is locked. An accountant reconciles. That's really the whole explanation. So I kept things. I kept the messages from that kitchen conversation and the ones after it, where Renee mentioned more than once how much simpler it was when people were left to assume. I never asked her to put it in writing. She just did, the way people do when they've never imagined the writing might outlive the moment. I didn't screenshot those out of suspicion. I screenshot everything that might matter later. I couldn't have told you at the time what later meant. I kept my son's hospital paperwork, obviously his birth certificate, his early medical records, the stack every parent keeps in a drawer and hopes never to need for anything but school enrollment. And I kept one document that cost more effort than the rest. 2 years after David and Renee married, I found a family law attorney in the town I'd moved to and arranged, quietly without telling anyone, to have paternity formally acknowledged and notarized. David signed it without incident. I never asked him for anything else. No support, no involvement, nothing that would have made him explain himself to anyone. I told him at the time it was so my son would have clear legal parentage on record in case anything happened to me. That was true. It just wasn't the only reason. I kept a folder, a physical one, of every financial record of support I never asked for and never got. Not because I planned to pursue anything. I want to be precise about that. I never once considered taking David to court, and I never told my son his father was anyone other than a man who wasn't in our lives. I kept the records the way I keep them for a company that hasn't asked for an audit yet, because someday somebody might. The family's version needed none of this. It ran fine on assumption. Renee's story never needed paperwork, because nobody had ever asked her for any. My mother repeated the infertility explanation at holidays the way you'd repeat any other fact about a relative, a job, a city, a diagnosis. Nobody checked it because families don't usually audit each other. That's not how love's supposed to work, and I understood that even while I sat on a folder that could have changed every conversation in that dining room. For years, the folder didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like insurance nobody would ever file a claim on. I'd built a life for my son that didn't depend on Renee's story getting corrected, and some nights I told myself the kindest thing was to let it stand. I never intended to use any of it. Not until my mother called, the December she invited us both home for Christmas, and asked gently whether I'd finally be bringing someone with me this year. There's exactly one person who's known the whole story from the start: my Aunt Miriam, my mother's younger sister, the one who never quite fit the family habit of smoothing things over. Miriam had done my taxes since I was 24, long before she was family to me in any formal sense. And somewhere in handing her 10 years of receipts and W-2s, I'd also handed her, without ever quite deciding to, the truth. She never told anyone, not out of loyalty to Renee or my mother or some idea of keeping the peace. It was loyalty to me, plain and unglamorous, the kind that doesn't need an audience. Miriam wasn't warm the way the rest of the family was warm. She didn't hug you twice at the door or ask about your feelings in a voice pitched for a crowd. She just remembered things. My son's birthday without being reminded. The exact year the infertility story started. She never once repeated it in front of me, not even by accident. Every December, she asked the same question in the same flat, practical tone she used for everything. Are you going to keep doing this? Not are you okay? Just, are you going to keep doing this, and for how much longer? For years I gave her the same answer. It's not the right time. He's too young to understand what he'd be walking into. It would hurt Mom more than it would fix anything. Miriam never argued. She just asked a little more precisely each year, until the excuses got harder to say out loud. That December, the one after my mother's phone call, she finally said it plainly, sitting across from me at her kitchen table with a folder of my own tax documents between us, like the conversation belonged in the same file. You've spent 10 years protecting people who've never once protected you, she said. Not your mother. Not Renee. Not even your own version of the story. I didn't answer right away. I'm never quick to answer things that matter. You keep records for a living, she said. You have everything you'd need, and you've had it for years. You're not hiding it because you're scared of what it proves. You're hiding it because you're scared of what happens once it's believed. She let that sit a moment, the way she let most things sit. Bring him this year, she said. Let them do the math themselves. My mother called 2 days later, the way she always did in early December, to talk through holiday plans as if we hadn't had the exact same conversation the year before and the year before that. We'd love to have you, she said. Renee and David and the kids will be there, of course. A small pause, the kind she'd perfected over a decade. And whatever your situation looks like this year, you're welcome to bring whoever that involves. Your situation. She'd never once said the word son, because as far as she knew, there wasn't one to name. I don't think she was being cruel. She was being careful, in the specific way people get careful around a subject they've decided not to look at too closely. She'd built a whole vocabulary around not asking, and I'd let her keep it year after year because correcting her would have meant correcting everything. I'll be there, I told her. And yes, I'll be bringing someone this year. She didn't ask who. That told me everything about how deeply the story had settled into this family. So completely that even a direct statement like that didn't disturb it. She just said she was glad and asked if we'd be arriving Friday or Saturday. I hung up and sat with it a long time before telling anyone I'd made a decision. It wasn't anger that decided it, whatever else was in the mix. I decided the way I make every real decision professionally. I looked at what I actually had and asked whether the story being told matched it. It hadn't for 10 years, and for the first time I had no reason left to keep it that way. I packed for that trip the way I pack for everything, efficiently, no sentiment. A few days of clothes. My son's things, folded the way he likes, though he didn't know yet why this Christmas felt different. And one folder. I didn't pack it because I'd decided that week to use it. I packed it because I finally understood I'd been carrying it for 10 years for exactly one reason, and I was done pretending otherwise. The night before we left, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a folder in front of me, unopened, longer than I want to admit. I asked myself, honestly, who this was actually for. Whether 10 years of composure had been a gift to my son or a debt I'd been quietly paying on someone else's behalf. I still don't have a clean answer to that. I'll ask you the same thing I asked myself that night. Have you ever kept a truth quiet to protect someone who never once protected you back? Not out of kindness, out of habit or fear, or just not knowing how to stop. If you have, stay with me. I think you'll recognize what happens next. The next morning, we drove to my mother's house. It smelled the way it always did at Christmas, cinnamon, pine, something with cloves simmering on the stove that nobody ever admitted to disliking. I asked my son to wait in the car a few minutes while I helped carry things in. He didn't ask why. He's a patient kid. I've wondered how much of that he learned from watching me. Renee was already there, wearing the easy warmth she reserved for rooms with more than 4 people in them. She hugged me the way she always did, a beat too long, a hand on my shoulder after, the physical vocabulary of someone playing devoted older sister for an audience. "You made it," she said. "Alone again this year?" I told her I hadn't decided yet how the afternoon would go. She laughed and turned to my Aunt Carol, who I hadn't seen come up. "Elena's always been the strong one," she said to Carol, though clearly for the room. Some women just weren't built for all that. I used to feel so guilty, honestly, having kids so easily when she couldn't. Carol made a sympathetic sound. Someone murmured something kind. I didn't correct any of it, not out of fear. I've learned over 18 years of audits that the worst thing you can do to a false story is interrupt it before it finishes proving itself. "Not everyone gets to be a mother," Renee added, softer now, the practiced softness of a line she delivered plenty of times. "It's just not fair sometimes, is it?" I looked at her exactly as long as it took to decide the sentence wasn't worth answering. Then I checked my watch. 4:52, my son was still in the car exactly as planned. I'd told him to come in at 5. 8 minutes. What I felt in that moment wasn't anger. And it wasn't hurt, though either would have made sense. It was closer to what I feel in the last minutes before presenting findings to a board that doesn't know yet what I found. A kind of stillness. The point where a story stops being negotiable. Renee kept talking. She always did when she had the room. How hard it must have been, watching her family grow all these years. She used the word bless twice. Touched my arm once. Gently, the way you'd touch someone you thought was grieving. I let her. I even nodded once at the right moment because nothing in the next 8 minutes needed me arguing with a story that was already, by then, over. At 4:59, I glanced toward the hallway. At 5 exactly, the doorbell rang. I opened it myself. My son stood on the porch in his good coat, the one we'd picked out together the week before, cheeks pink from the cold. "Can I come in now?" he asked. I told him yes, took his hand, and walked him into the living room the way you'd walk into any room where people you love are waiting. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It dropped out in pieces, like a held note, losing instruments one by one. My mother first, mid-sentence, mouth still slightly open. Then Carol. Then Renee, whose laugh just ran out of road. They weren't looking at a stranger. They were looking at something they recognized and hadn't expected to. My son has David's exact jawline. David's hairline, the way it sits low and square at the temples. David's habit of tilting his head slightly before he speaks, which he doesn't get from me, and which I've watched him do 1,000 times without ever mentioning it to anyone in that room. "This is Noah," I said. "My son. He's 10. Nobody said anything for a moment. I let the silence hold, the way I let it hold in every meeting where the numbers are about to speak for themselves. "I don't understand," my mother finally said quietly. "You never said, I know," I said. "I'll explain everything. But I want to be clear about one thing first, because it matters more than anything else I'm going to say today." I looked at Renee. I never told anyone I was infertile. That was never something I said. Renee's face had gone very still. "Elena, what is this? What are you doing?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm just done letting a story stand that was never true." "That's not fair," she said, an edge in her voice now, the first real edge I'd heard from her in years. "You can't bring a child into my mother's house and imply—" "I'm not implying anything," I said. I brought a folder. I set it on the coffee table, next to the cider, next to the good napkins, in the middle of everything that made the room look like Christmas. I opened it to a single page and turned it to face her and didn't say another word about what it was. I didn't need to. A notarized acknowledgement of paternity, dated 11 years earlier, 2 full years before Renee and David married. David's signature at the bottom, plain and unremarkable, the kind of document that sits quietly in a drawer for a decade doing nothing except being true. Renee read it. Twice, I think. "David," she said without looking up. Her voice had changed entirely, smaller, less certain of the room. David didn't answer right away. When he did, it was 2 words, quiet, aimed at no one in particular. "I signed that. That was all." He didn't explain, and I didn't ask him to. I hadn't brought him into this. He'd done that himself 11 years earlier at a different kitchen table in a different life. Renee's hand was still holding her wine glass. I don't think she'd noticed it had started to shake, the way you don't notice your own hands until they've already stopped listening to you. You knew, she said. Not a question. The whole time, I said. I just never needed anyone else to. The glass slipped before she'd finished the sentence, not thrown, not dropped in any dramatic way, just released, the way a hand releases something it's forgotten it's holding. It hit the floor and came apart in one clean sound, and for 4 or 5 seconds that was the only thing anyone in the room could hear. Nobody moved to pick up. It sat there in pieces, catching light from the tree, while Renee tried for a second to rebuild something out of what was left of her composure. This isn't your twisting this, she said. I never said you were infertile. I never used that word. You let it be true for 10 years, I said. There's a difference between not saying a thing and not stopping it. I was protecting you, she said, her voice cracking slightly on protecting. Like even she could hear how it landed with that document still open on the table. In this family, we don't air dirty laundry. We protect each other. I'd heard her say that line before, dozens of times over dozens of years, always right when it was most useful to her. I know, I said. I've been protecting this family from the truth for 10 years. I'm done today. She didn't answer that. She looked at David instead, and whatever she hoped to find in his face, she didn't find it. He was looking at the floor, at the broken glass, at anything that wasn't the kid standing quietly beside me. My mother spoke next, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Renee, she said, did you know? When you married him, did you know? Renee didn't answer that either, and the silence answered it for her. I watched my mother's face change in a way that told me she'd suspected more than she'd ever let herself admit, a detail filed away and never followed, much the way I'd once filed my own doubts away and called it kindness. I understood that better than anyone in the room. I wasn't there to destroy my sister. I'd had 10 years to imagine a version of this moment built entirely on that impulse, and it never once felt like the ending I actually wanted. What I wanted was smaller than that, and it had been sitting unmet for a decade. I wanted to stop apologizing for a lie I never told. I'm not here to ruin your life, I told Renee evenly. And I'm not going to explain this to anyone else in the family. That's not my job anymore. It's yours. She looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something in her face that wasn't performance. From here, I said, you've got one choice. Tell the truth going forward to whoever asks, or lose whatever relationship you were hoping to have with him. I glanced down at Noah, then back at her. Not both. Not after 10 years of the other version. She didn't answer. I hadn't expected her to. Not yet. I took my son's hand. It's time to go, I told him quietly, and for the first time all evening my own voice, steady as it had been through all of it, finally felt like mine again. It's been almost a year now. My mother says Noah's name easily, the way a grandmother should, like there was never a version of our family where she couldn't. Renee and I are still rebuilding something, slowly on different terms that don't need anyone to remember which story we're supposed to be telling. Not everything got repaired. Some things stayed broken, and I've made my peace with that. What matters is that whatever's left of this family runs on what actually happened now, not on what was easier to believe. If you've ever carried a truth alone for someone who never carried anything for you, I'd like to hear it. Share it if you're willing. And if you want the next one, subscribe. There's always another.